This story is a tragedy. This is the business end. By the autumn of 1990, satellite television as a concept teetered on the brink of annihilation. Two services struggled together to what looked increasingly likely to be mutually assured destruction. BSB was supposed to be the official national broadcaster, with an increasingly vague public service remit and commitment on paper to original programming of quality. And they were openly resigned at this point to coming second to Sky. But their rivals were doing almost as badly, with the expense of Sky News in particular, and Murdoch's entire empire with it, into the red. There was blood in the water, so much that Murdoch quickly realised that the feeding frenzy was inevitable. The best strategy was to find a shark of his own. For Sam Chisholm's 50th birthday, he received a brand new Harley Davidson. It was winched via crane to the third floor of the Nine Network headquarters, where he ruled Australia's most popular channel with 12 iron fists. It was then driven into the boardroom by his personal chauffeur, with Miss Australia riding pillion. At least that's how the story goes. What is certain is the gifts their employees got on the same day to mark the occasion. Redundancy. The network's owner, Alan Bond, who'd only bought it from Kerry Packer 2 years earlier, was on the precipice of bankruptcy, a precipice he would eventually go over all the way to prison. You might remember him buying a stake in BSB, to which he then added Virgin's interest when they got cold feet. As an investor in BSB, he had turned out to be useless, eventually cashing out in a blind panic just as Virgin had when the Nine deal inevitably started to go south. He eventually sold the Nine network back to Kerry Packer after the Australian High Court had, in highly legally binding terms, labelled him an idiot. But long before then, Sam Chisholm had left for pastures new, specifically Sky, which does lead to the interesting conclusion that through a tangled web of corporate incompetence, Alan Bond managed to deal 2 separate death blows to BSB without even trying. Sam Chisholm's first act as chief executive of Sky was to change the executive meeting regime from a set of relatively good-humoured fortnightly get-togethers at 9:30 into terrifying weekly boot camps at 8:30 sharp, with himself as foul-mouthed, borderline psychotic drill sergeant. The first item at the first of these was the resignation of the sales director. After the meeting, someone called her to commiserate and ended up breaking the news to her instead. The rest of the week, Chisholm was barely visible, preferring to lock himself away in his office like Smaug protecting his gold. This was all in contrast to his predecessor Rupert Murdoch, who could often be seen walking down his corridors, eating in the cafeteria, chatting with his workers as if he considered them autonomous human beings. It was clear now that was just a good cop routine, and bad cop was in charge now. But it took a monster to do what was necessary to save Sky. Cut to the bone. They were losing close on £3 million a week by now. Chisholm fired people left, right and centre, a different person at every executive meeting, but that was all just drops in the ocean. Eventually he had to break it to Murdoch that there was only one option that he could see to ensure the company's long-term survival. Kill Sky News completely. Which of course wasn't an option. In Murdoch's struggle for world domination, this was his Death Star. Besides, it was pretty much the only thing on Sky that was any good, that wasn't just empty entertainment calories. To drop it would do their image irreparable harm, and that was important in more than just ratings terms. The Broadcasting Bill 1990, the same one that deregulated British television, dismantled the IBA and basically put the whole industry on the same war footing as Sky, was still working its way through Parliament, and Sky's survival in its wake was far from guaranteed as yet. Sky News might have been costing $40 million a year, but it was the most important $40 million in the company. Chisholm typically took no notice and tried to strangle it to death anyway as soon as Murdoch left the room, but he eventually settled for a 10% reduction instead, a principle that was then applied to the rest of the Sky package as well. Immediately, anything with real production values vanished from Sky's screens. The big name signings like Frank Boff and John Stapleton disappeared. Almost every original programme on Sky News, other than the news itself, was axed and replaced with vaguely similar but far cheaper foreign imports. When the butchery was over, the company had indeed saved enough money to continue stumbling on for a little while longer. But long-term prospects remained bleak. One option and one option alone loomed out of the distance. Murdoch, Chisholm and Sky turned their heads to Marco Polo House. Actually, there were two options facing the two companies. One was a fight to the death, which was where the two companies were at that point, and at this point it was clear that it would be the death of both. As for the other, well, both companies still wanted the public to think that the other was peaceful coexistence, that there was room for both services after all. But that was just desperate spin concocted to try and calm the market, and anyone even tangentially involved with either company knew it. By the autumn of 1990, neither one could even pretend anymore. No, the real second option remained what it always was: a merger. Merger was a dirty word in Marco Polo House for a long time, but it had been floating about just as long as the reality of a competitor had. On the day of Sky's announcement, Richard Branson had considered the depth of Murdoch's pockets and the probable advantage his company would have in going first, and came to the conclusion that a merger was inevitable. So he invited Murdoch to his houseboat in order to try and save everyone some time and pain and tie the two together from the start. But that was never going to be as satisfying for Murdoch as the prospect of fighting and winning, which he was confident was going to happen. A few months later, Virgin left the BSB consortium, selling its stake to Alan Bond, who was starting to struggle with the Nine network and would soon pack up and follow Branson & Co. out the door. And so it all goes around. BSB's public stance on a merger was always, why would we want to do a thing like that when we're already better? But as we've seen, better doesn't mean successful. By September, even ASG was allowing the word to pass his lips. He qualified it with, I can't quite see it in practical terms, but at the same time he acknowledged that the more blood both companies lost, the less choice there would be. But it must be a merger, he stressed, and not a takeover. That remained to be seen. By October, negotiations were going on in earnest, and under extreme secrecy. The minutes were shredded at the end of each meeting. Not even ASG knew what was going on, not being privy to the meetings themselves. BSB's other two main executives, John Gow and Ian Clubb, were already there. Sending all three would have been a mite suspicious. Besides, he was just a chief executive. The company was now so deep in the red that the shareholders were almost the only people who counted. It was obvious who had the upper hand. BSB had the official title, the Public Service Remit, and the backing of the IBA. But by now the Broadcasting Bill had become the Broadcasting Act. The IBA were all but defunct already, and public service broadcasting no longer meant a whole lot. They did, however, have actual advertisers, a source of income Sky still lacked.
Well, do you know how to get Gerald to Chester without going under any low bridges?
No, but I know a man who does.
On the other hand, Sky had the vast majority of subscribers, and most important of all, the tacit backing of the Thatcher government. Murdoch was a trusted friend and occasional advisor to the PM. She had a TV almost constantly tuned to Sky News, and his papers were her loudest propaganda instrument. And when the satellite company started to suffer, her culture minister David Mellor lauded their channels as being simultaneously in the public interest and a sterling example of private enterprise at work which the government would never touch in 1,000 years. Of course, by this point her premiership could be measured in weeks, but we didn't know that yet. But even given all this, the nature of the final deal came as a shock.
Britain's two satellite television stations, Sky and BSB, have merged. In a deal finalised tonight, the two companies have agreed to share programming, so viewers with either station's satellite dish will receive the same programmes. The new company will be called British Sky Broadcasting.
The new joint company to be announced tonight will be controlled jointly by News International, the present owners of Sky Television, and by the present owners of BSB. The managing director of the new company will be the present chief executive of Sky, Mr. Sam Chisholm. Joint deputy managing directors will be Sky's Gary Davey and BSB's Ian Clubb.
Last night's merger is in reality a victory for Sky. To begin with, the new 5-channel service will continue on both satellites, but in due course it'll be carried only on Sky's satellite, and viewers with BSB receivers are likely to be offered Sky dishes instead. BSB's film channel will form part of the new service, but other BSB programmes are likely to be scrapped, and hundreds of staff may lose their jobs.
It was called a merger. It was a hostile takeover. The deal favoured Murdoch and his company to an extent that bordered on dystopian satire. Ownership of the new company would be divided in half, which sounded good on paper until he realised that that meant full 50% of the company would be owned by Rupert Murdoch personally. Almost all that remained of BSB were those two words in the company's name, British Sky Broadcasting, although the company was to be known on screen as simply Sky. B-Sky-B was to be run by Sam Chisholm, with his current deputy Gary Davey, neither of them changing their jobs in any practical sense whatsoever, although Ian Clubb did share Gary Davies' title of Deputy Managing Director for a little while. His new boss, however, was a marked contrast to ASG. Going from the accommodating English gentleman to a perpetually enraged Kiwi Sir Les Patterson knockoff gave Clubb whiplash, and he moved on before long to have great success with First Choice Holidays. But then he was fortunate enough to be one of the few BSB employees retained by the new company. B-Sky-B also took on Richard Brooke as their finance director, and most importantly Vic Wakeling, who went on to build Sky's most stable foundation and greatest innovation in Sky Sports, which really did revolutionise British television forever.
This is Sky Sports, a part of the British Sky Broadcasting Network.
Everyone else was done, made redundant, given their notice, placed on gardening leave, or just plain sacked. Marco Polo House, that neoparian-clad monument to form over function, was abandoned. It had no use now. The satellites named after it, by now there were two, were similarly placed on death row, left to twirl meaninglessly in space until finally finding a home 3 years later in the satellite industries of Sweden and Norway. And as for DMAC, that great technological breakthrough that BSB was based on, its bane and its glory BMAC was dead. A make-or-break condition of the original negotiations had been the exclusive use, once the Marco Polo satellite's contract was up, of Astra and PAL, and a promising new technology was murdered in its cot. As for BSB's channels, the spin was that their 5 and Sky's 4 were being merged together like the companies. In the event they were. The companies didn't actually merge either. The B-Sky-B era began 3 days after the major era did, with the final broadcast on the 1st of December 1990 from Now, the channel for living. What was left of its programming was folded into Sky News, except for the few remaining weekend arts shows, which went out on an opt-out service broadcasting via Marco Polo on the Sky News frequency, which was called Sky Arts.
This is Sky Arts, a part of the British Sky Broadcasting Network. And now I'll hand you over to Robert Teer to tell you more about today's opera.
Yes, they finally managed to launch it. Inside 2 years, the prophecy came true. How about that? Once that little contractual obligation was burnt off, Sky Arts was packed up and forgotten for the next 15 years. The day after Now died, Galaxy followed. With whatever remained of its programming glued to Sky One. The Power Station and the Sports Channel managed to cling on until April. In the former case, I suspect that they were still under contract to show that year's worth of broadcasting, just as with Now, but there wasn't really anywhere obvious on the Sky platform to fold it into, so they just burnt it off as itself until the contract was up. As for the Sports Channel, well, that simply became Sky Sports, and so could be said to technically still exist today, in a sort of ship of Theseus sense, if at some point in the metaphor Theseus had had his entire ship sunk and rebuilt from scratch. The Movie Channel was the only one of BSB's stations to survive in more or less its original form, but then this was a real jewel in the crown. All these studio deals they spent nearly $1 billion on were now in Sky's hands, as was the channel they went on. So the Movie Channel survived, albeit with a new, glossy and somewhat charmless logo and ident to match the rest of the Sky platform.
This is the Movie Channel, a part of the British Sky Broadcasting Network.
As for Datavision and the Computer Channel, they'd already been closed altogether as an unjustifiable expense. ASG had his entire life pulled out from underneath him. Whatever belongings of his remained in Marco Polo House were boxed up and delivered to his home, because he, as an unemployed civilian, was forbidden from entering the building that B-Sky-B were about to vacate anyway. He had to watch from outside as everything about the company to which he had devoted 3 years of his life, that he strove to establish as Britain's broadcaster for the 21st century, was wiped from the record. Everything of BSB was erased, unhappened. The last evidence it had ever existed at all was the occasional glimpse of a squarial, now rendered obsolete, hanging uselessly off the house of some unfortunate who backed the wrong horse. In time, as the new company became the media giant we all know and love today, what little difference there was between it and the original Sky Television disappeared from the public consciousness. BSB was all but forgotten. You know what became of Sky and Murdoch. Sam Chisholm is astonishingly enough still alive, despite having lost both of his original lungs to his beloved cigarettes. John Gow went back to John Gow Productions. Anthony Simmons Gooding will be 78 on the 10th of September, and now lives in Kerry with his wife Marjorie, painting pictures and relishing Murdoch's occasional troubles. Incidentally, Marjorie was diagnosed with breast cancer shortly after BSB's collapse, because apparently they hadn't had enough to deal with already. After her recovery, they set up the Macmillan Nurse Appeal. BSkyB dropped the Bs a couple of years ago and became Sky UK Limited. The same year, Marco Polo House was demolished, having been occupied over the years by QVC and by another doomed competitor of Sky. The satellites named after it have long since decayed out of all use and now hover in the upper atmosphere among acres of other obsolete space equipment. Just another floating relic of a future that, as futures do, became the past. For BSB, it became the past far too soon. I said at the start that it all could have been different. The IBA or the government could have stepped in at the end and mediated a fairer merger, for example. But that would require a completely different government, one that hadn't just dealt a death blow to the IBA in the Broadcasting Act 1990, not to mention one that wasn't in the process of tearing itself apart. BSB as we know it could only have succeeded if Murdoch had never made his deal with Astra, if Sky had never existed. Everything about BSB was designed to operate as a monopoly. Every plan it ever made was drawn up under the assumption that without competition they had a lot more wiggle room than they eventually ended up with. Most of its mistakes, its mismanagement, its technological struggles could eventually have been overcome if they didn't have a competitor to worry about. Remember, even before Sky existed, it was pretty much accepted as a given that BSB wasn't going to start making a profit until 1993 at the earliest. They were superior in almost every way to the 1989-1990 incarnation of Sky Television. Sky's sole advantage was in getting there first, and that turned out to be enough. Once BSB arrived, their obvious superiority was simply too little, too late. It's hard to think of a clearer or more potent illustration of the lie that competition automatically benefits quality. You can still see the odd squarial if you know where to look, more than a quarter of a century since the brief window when they were of any use. Vanguards of a dream that just couldn't break into reality. As soon as it made the attempt, it was devoured. But it was a beautiful dream. A new frontier in broadcasting. The final frontier. Signals beamed from space, bypassing the limits of earthbound transmission. And a chunk of this new frontier had been carved out and planted with a Union Jack. A 5-channel network. An ITV in space. With public broadcasting remit and strong British values. It was a beautiful dream. And then they woke up. Bye.